First of all, subscribe channel. I never expected my quiet afternoon at the office to turn into a moment that would stay with me for months. But when my neighbor stepped through my door, carrying a calm smile and a message I never saw coming, everything shifted in the most surprising way. Before we begin, tell me from which cities you're watching us today. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It helps more than you know. The day started like any other, steady and predictable, the kind of day that usually comforts me. My office sits on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, overlooking a narrow street where the afternoon sun slips between awnings and old storefront signs. I've worked there for years, long enough to know every sound the building makes, every creak in the wooden floorboards, every echo in the hallway. So when I heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, I knew instantly they didn't belong to anyone from my team. A soft knock followed, almost hesitant. I looked up from the stack of papers on my desk and called for the person to come in. And there he was, Mark, my neighbor from across the street. I'd known him for years in a polite, passing conversation sort of way. He was the type of man whose presence carries a quiet steadiness, like he's never in a hurry, but somehow always on time. He stepped inside, holding his hat in one hand, as if unsure whether he was interrupting something important. The sunlight behind him outlined the edges of his shoulders, giving the moment an almost gentle glow. I felt my breath catch, unexpectedly, at the sight of someone so familiar appearing in a place where he never had before. I asked him what brought him by, and he gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes at first. He said he'd been walking past, saw my light on, and felt an impulse he couldn't ignore. He spoke carefully, choosing each word like it mattered. There was something different in his tone, something considerate, something sincere. It felt like he had been carrying the weight of this visit for a while. He looked around the room before settling his gaze on me, and that was when he said it, that sometimes the people we think we know in passing are actually the ones who understand us without us realizing it. The simplicity of the statement, the unexpected warmth behind it, settled into the room like a soft breeze. I felt it more deeply than I expected. Not because his words were dramatic, they weren't, but because they were true in a way I hadn't taken the time to consider. I invited him to sit, and he did, resting his hat on his knee. The air between us held a quiet tension, not uncomfortable, just unusually clear, like two people suddenly aware they'd been walking parallel lines without ever crossing until now. We talked about small things at first, the kind of everyday topics neighbors share. But beneath that, something else moved, an awareness, a gentle curiosity, a shared understanding that neither of us acknowledged out loud yet. The office felt different with him there. The hum of the old ceiling fan, the faint smell of paper and coffee, the soft amber sunlight, it all seemed sharper, more meaningful. And I realized, as we continued talking, that his visit wasn't random. It was the beginning of something I hadn't expected to feel again at this stage in my life. By the time he stood to leave, the room felt warmer, somehow fuller. He paused at the doorway, looked back at me with a thoughtful expression, and said he hoped he hadn't overstepped by coming. I told him he hadn't. Truthfully, his presence lingered long after he walked out, staying with me like the echo of a sentence that hasn't finished yet. And that was how it began, the moment that changed the way I looked at my days, my routines, and even myself. For the rest of that afternoon, I found myself glancing toward the door as if Mark might quietly appear again. Of course he didn't, but the memory of his visit lingered, soft, steady, a bit surprising in its effect on me. I tried focusing on my work, yet every few minutes my mind drifted back to the way he spoke, the way he looked around my office, like he was seeing it for the first time. Or maybe seeing me for the first time. That evening, as I stepped outside and locked up, the street felt unusually calm. The air carried that early evening coolness that settles in once the sun dips behind the old buildings. I noticed Mark standing across the street, not waiting for me, just watering the small row of plants lining his porch. When he spotted me, he lifted a hand in greeting. Something about the simplicity of that gesture made my heart feel lighter than it had in a long time. I walked over, telling myself it was the polite thing to do. Acknowledge a neighbor, nothing more. But the truth was, I wanted to understand what had been behind his words earlier. He turned off the hose, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his back pocket, and smiled warmly. The kind of smile that makes you feel like you've been missed, even if only a few hours have passed. He asked how the rest of my day went, and I told him honestly that it had felt different after his visit. His expression shifted slightly, a thoughtful seriousness passing through his eyes. He didn't respond right away, and during that pause, I realized how rare it was to speak with someone who took a moment to consider their words instead of rushing through them. He finally told me that he'd been feeling a pull to reconnect with people around him more, something about the way time has a habit of slipping by unnoticed until one day you look up and realize you've been living quietly instead of fully. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. We stood there for a while, neither of us in a hurry, the porch light casting a soft glow on the old wooden steps. At one point, a gentle breeze lifted a strand of my hair, and I brushed it back while he watched me with that same attentive calm he carried earlier. Not intrusive, not searching, just present. There's something deeply grounding about being seen like that, especially by someone who chooses to see you. He asked if I had plans for the evening. I told him I didn't, that I'd probably just read for a bit or catch up on a show I'd been meaning to finish. He nodded, then said he hoped my night would be peaceful. And again, it was the simplicity of his tone that caught me off guard. Most people wish each other well out of habit. Mark said it like he meant it. When I finally walked home, his words followed me just as they had earlier in the office. I made tea, settled into my living room, and tried to unwind, but the quiet around me felt different now, like my thoughts had someone else's voice mixed into them. I realized then that life doesn't always announce the moments that matter. Sometimes they arrive in the shape of a neighbor stepping into your office, or a conversation across a porch at dusk. And sometimes they leave you with a question you can't ignore. Why did his presence feel so significant? As I drifted to sleep that night, I knew there was something unfolding, slowly, thoughtfully, between two people who had spent years simply nodding at each other across the street. The next morning arrived with an unusual energy, the kind that sits quietly in the background like a soft hum. I woke earlier than usual, made my coffee, and found myself looking out the window toward Mark's house. His curtains were open, and I could see him moving around inside, starting his day the same steady way he always did. Still, something felt different now, some new layer to the familiar view. At work, my mind wandered more than I wanted it to. I kept replaying our conversation from the night before, especially the way he spoke about time slipping by. It struck a chord deep in me. I'd always been someone who kept busy, who found comfort in routine, but lately I had started feeling that quiet restlessness that comes with realizing life can be more than the steady rhythm we're used to. In the early afternoon, while I was sorting through a pile of old files, I heard footsteps again. This time I didn't hesitate. I stood, almost expecting to see him there. But the hallway stayed empty. I felt a little silly for anticipating it, yet there was no denying the small flutter of disappointment. Not 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mark. He rarely texted anyone, and receiving a message from him felt almost out of place, like a whisper in a quiet room. He wrote that he hoped I was having a smooth day, and that he had something on his mind he wanted to talk about when I had a moment. I stared at the message longer than necessary, wondering what could possibly be weighing on him. I replied, telling him I'd be free after closing, and that he could stop by if he wanted. His response came quickly, as if he'd been waiting for mine. He said he would come by. The rest of the day felt slower, each hour stretching farther than the last. When closing time finally came, I straightened the room out, more carefully than usual, I'd admit. I had opened the window to let some fresh air drift in, and the late afternoon light painted the office in warm, soft gold. Right on time, I heard his footsteps in the hallway. This time I knew it was him instantly. The steady, unhurried rhythm matched his presence perfectly. He knocked gently and stepped inside when I called out. He seemed a bit more serious than the day before, not troubled, but thoughtful. He looked around, then met my eyes with a kind of sincerity that pulled me right into the moment. He told me he'd been thinking a lot since our conversation on his porch. He said that talking with me had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection that didn't rely on shared history, but on an understanding that grows naturally, quietly, between two people who simply listen to each other. I felt my chest tighten a bit, not out of worry, but from the weight of what he was sharing. I invited him to sit, and he did, resting his hands on his knees, like he was grounding himself before continuing. He said he didn't want to assume anything or place expectations on our conversations, but he also didn't want to ignore what he felt, that our recent interactions had brought a sense of clarity and comfort he'd missed. He spoke gently, giving space between his words, allowing me to absorb them fully. I told him I understood more than he realized, that I, too, had felt something shifting, something subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders eased, and a quiet relief passed over his face. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply two people recognizing the same truth at the same moment. We talked for a long time after that, about our lives, our regrets, the things we'd learned along the way. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two voices sharing space in a room warmed by fading sunlight. When he finally stood to leave, he paused by the door once more. He said he didn't want to move too fast or make assumptions, but he wanted me to know he valued whatever was forming between us. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet office, absorbing everything. Something was unfolding, something I hadn't expected, but suddenly felt ready for. The next few days carried a softness I hadn't felt in years. Even the small routines of life seemed to settle differently around me. Morning coffee tasted a little richer. The walk to my office felt warmer, as if the familiar world had shifted just enough to feel new again. And each time I glanced toward Mark's house, I felt that steady calm he carried begin to settle into me as well. One evening, after a long day of catching up on paperwork, I stepped outside and found the sky painted in deep shades of orange and rose. The air held that comfortable coolness that settles in just before nightfall. I lingered on the steps of my office, watching the street slowly quiet down, when I noticed Mark walking toward me. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. His steps were measured, confident, and somehow reassuring. When he reached me, he offered a quiet greeting, and I felt that familiar warmth rise in my chest. We fell into step together, walking slowly down the sidewalk without any real destination. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the old bakery that had reopened, a neighbor's new garden project. But beneath the gentle flow of conversation, something more meaningful rested comfortably, like a shared understanding neither of us needed to name. As we walked, he paused near a bench under one of the tall trees lining the street. The branches overhead filtered the last hints of daylight, scattering soft shadows on the pavement. We sat down, both facing the soft glow of the evening lights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that comes when two people trust the space between them. Eventually, he turned slightly toward me and said he'd been thinking a lot since our last conversation. He said he didn't want to lose whatever had begun forming between us, that it felt too genuine, too grounding, to ignore. His voice held no urgency, just honesty, the kind that settles straight into your heart because it's spoken without expectation. I told him I felt the same, that his visit to my office had opened a part of me I'd quietly tucked away over the years. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Life has a way of convincing us to stay in our routines, to keep our distance even when we crave connection. His arrival had shifted that for me, reminding me that it's never too late to rediscover pieces of ourselves we thought had gone quiet. He listened closely, nodding slowly, his eyes thoughtful. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that night. That connection doesn't always start with grand moments. It starts with noticing someone, truly noticing them, even after years of passing by without a second thought. We sat there together, watching the sky fade into dusk. The world around us felt calm, steady and full in a way that surprised me. There was no rush forward, no anxiety about what came next. Just two people sharing a moment that felt both simple and deeply meaningful. After a while, he offered me his hand, not dramatically, not boldly, just gently, as if offering a steadying touch. I placed my hand in his, and the quiet understanding that passed between us felt like a promise. Not of anything hurried, but of something sincere, something we'd build slowly, with care. We walked back toward our homes at an easy pace, still talking softly. When we reached my door, he paused and thanked me, not for anything specific, but for allowing space for whatever this was to begin. I thanked him too, because his words and presence had shifted something inside me that I hadn't realized needed shifting. Later that night, as I sat by my window with a warm cup of tea, I felt a sense of renewal settle over me. Not the kind that comes from sudden change, but the kind that grows step by step, conversation by conversation. Life had surprised me in a way I didn't expect, and for the first time in a long while, I looked forward to whatever tomorrow might bring.